So welcome to the 12th edition of the Ramanujan Math and IT conference. So this edition, like the previous edition, due to pandemic, we had to do it fully online. But nonetheless, we have two excellent researchers and speakers who will be presenting their talks today. So first is Professor Debdeep Mukhopadhyay. But before that, I would like to invite our director, Professor Debdeep, to inaugurate this conference and also address the gathering, please.
Thank you, Professor Vivek Srinivas. So welcome to 12th edition of the Ramanujan Math and IT conference, which is always hosted by IIIT-Bangalore in honor in the name of Ramanujan, who has contributions well known to all of us. His math and later on in India, flourishing in the areas of information technology, which is the larger umbrella of computer science and ECE and any other departments of the works. So we have thought of the collect this math and IT conference in the name of this great man, Ramanujan. And thanks to my colleagues, Professor Vivek Srinivas, Professor Prasanna, Professor Manisha, for arranging all these speakers and all those logistics for this conference, and also the volunteers. And it's a really pleasure to see Professor Debdeep Mukhopadhyay being the inaugural speaker, and he has his labs, SEAL labs, which is been doing very well. I have heard about it before. And without delay, let us over to Dr. Srinivas Vivek to start the proceedings for the conference. And thank you again, and have a wonderful time and the talks. And thank you, Professor Debdeep Mukhopadhyay, for giving your time for this talk.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Das, for your kind words. So let me introduce Professor Debdeep Mukhopadhyay. So he's currently a professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, IIT Kharagpur. At IIT Kharagpur, he founded the Secured Embedded Architecture Laboratory, SEAL, so with its focus on hardware security. He has worked as visiting scientist at NTU Singapore, visiting associate professor of New York University, Shanghai, assistant professor at IIT Madras, and visiting researcher at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. He holds PhD and MS and BTech from IIT Kharagpur. He has authored a couple of books, including Fault-Tolerant Architectures for Cryptography and Hardware Security, published by Springer, Cryptography and Network Security, Hardware Security, Design Threats and Safeguards, and Timing Channels in Cryptography. He has written more than 250 papers in peer-reviewed conferences and journals, and collaborated with several Indian and foreign organizations. He has been on the program committee and editorial boards of several top international conferences and journals. Professor Mukhopadhyay is the recipient of the prestigious Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award for this year in the Science and Technology category, and is a fellow of the Indian National Academy of Engineers. He was awarded the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship for the year 2015-16 by the Department of Science and Technology. He has also received an award from the Data Security Council of India for Cybersecurity Education, ASEM DO Fellowship, INSA Young Scientist Award, INA Young Engineer Award, Associateship for the Indian Academy of Sciences. He was awarded the Outstanding Young Faculty Fellowship from IIT Kharagpur, and the Techno Inventor Best PhD Award from the Indian Semiconductor Association. He has recently incubated a startup on hardware security, ESP Private Limited, at IIT Kharagpur, and he's also a senior member of IEEE and ACM. Now, it would not be an exaggeration to say that Professor Debdeep Mukhopadhyay has been a main force for the research on hardware security and cryptographic engineering in India. So he will be speaking on side channel and microarchitectural attacks on modern crypto systems. So with that, it's our great pleasure to again welcome Professor Mukhopadhyay, and over to you, Professor.
So first of all, I would like to say my thanks to all of you. Thanks to Professor Das, thanks to Srinivas, and thanks to all of you to invite me for this to this prestigious gathering. So it's an honor and privilege for me, and I would be very happy to give this talk. So the title of my talk is Every Contact Leaves a Trace, and I will try to kind of, explain why I start with this phrase. In particular, I shall be talking about side channel and microarchitecture attacks on modern microsystems, which is essentially also the primary area of my research. So to begin with, I would like to mention that this work has been an output or outcome of collaborations with several of my present and former research students. Dr. Chester Rebedo, who is currently a faculty at IIT Madras, Dr. Sharoni Bhattacharya, who is working at IMEC Belgium, Anirban, who is currently doing his PhD at IIT Kharagpur, and Arnav, who is also doing his PhD. Dr. Subid Ali, who is currently a faculty at IIT Bhilai, Chandip Shaha, who just finished his PhD and is joining NTU as a postdoc, Shikhar, who is, after his PhD, is working at Visa, Devopriyo, who is just joined at IIT Kanpur, and Upi also, who has joined at IIT Kanpur as a faculty, and Manar, who also just submitted his thesis and is planning to join NYU as a postdoc. So to begin with, roughly the area of this talk, right, will be around this topic of hardware security. So which tries to address the gap between theory and practice. So we all know this classic overview of cryptography, where we have got, say, Alice and Bob communicating over an untrusted communication channel, and there is an eavesdropper, say Mallory, who is curious and is trying to kind of subvert the objectives of this communication. So now we know that cryptographic theory has limitations, because of which, right, and because of this absence of theory for the reality, even mathematically strong ciphers can leak potentially in the real world through certain information sources, which we called as side channels. So these side channel sources essentially result in information leakage and often the compromise of confidentiality and other objectives of the cryptographic operations. So what I essentially try to mean, let me try to illustrate by an example and try to kind of say why designing secure crypto systems is quite intricate. So when you talk about theory, say, let's make a theoretical statement saying that let G be any group where discrete log problem is hard. So we know that discrete log problem is a potentially hard problem, and there are many cryptographic algorithms that have been developed around it. Now, when you want to go into practice, you need an instantiation of this hard problem. And say often we realize it by saying that standard elliptic curves, or ECC, are essentially the group on which I would like to operate. And in this group, what we call as ECDLP, or the elliptic curve discrete log problem, is assumed to be hard. Now, in this translation from theory to practice, there are many attacks that actually can break real-world ECC without even trying to solve the ECDLP problem. So these results often from bad curve choices, or maybe from poor implementations, and so on and so forth. So there is an exciting line of research from Dan Bernstein where he gives this proposal of safe curves and so on. Dan Bernstein and Tanya Lange. So this essentially is kind of trying to point out that while in theory, there is the theory and practice are same, but in practice, they are not really the same. And this leads us to this fascinating journey from theory to practice, trying to see that whether we can translate our theoretical foundations into practically secured instances. So in order to pursue research in this direction, we set up this lab, which we called a Secured Embedded Architecture Lab, or C-Lab, primarily trying to look into the various attacks and countermeasures. And this lab has been around for more than 10 years now at IIT Kharagpur. So just to give an overview of our research focus, we started to work on VLSI of crypto systems, and then formal verifications for such complex crypto designs, cycle analysis and countermeasures, which I will try to talk in this presentation. We are recently trying to also venture in the area of implementing post-quantum crypto algorithms, microarchitecture attacks, which I will also try to talk in today's discussion, Trojan designs and detections, physically unclonable functions, IoT security, machine learning for attacks and defenses, and of course, cyber physical system security. So during this work, we have collaborated with several academic and industrial partners, both inside the country as well as outside. So one of the primary, importance or requirements of our line of research is to validate the theoretical claims through actual practical experiments. And in order to do that, we have developed a state-of-the-art laboratory on side channels, IoT security, cyber physical system security, and hardware forensics. So these are some of the sort of snapshots from our laboratory, which basically tries to put life into our research. So this brings me to the outline of my talk. First, I will try to give a bird's eye view on side channel analysis, followed by a component on microarchitecture attacks. And finally, I will try to give some of the important attacks that we found out, and I call that as modern times of microarchitecture attacks. So, so we all know that the internet is essentially growing and is also kind of developing. It's kind of I would say is also evolving into newer generations. And in the newer generations of what we call as Internet of Things or cyber physical systems, we often try to connect billions of devices together. Often some of them are critical devices like cars, pacemakers, electrical grids, and so on. So one of the reasons why we try to do that is because potentially IoTs can revolutionize the quality of life. However, there is a caveat. The caveat is like commercial IoT devices lack security measures, and this can have catastrophic consequences to mankind. So in the Indian context, IoT also has got a lot of promise. But again, one thing that we should look into is the security threats and try to see that whether they are really secured against these menacing attack vectors. So in order to start this discussion and bring in the context of side channel attack, I will try to kind of focus on this paper, which was published in IIITB Symposium on Security and Privacy in 2017. So this paper tries to target, it's written by an Israeli group, and they try to target some of these IoT systems, which are actually called as Philips Hue lights, which are basically smart bulbs. So the idea is that there are some smart bulbs, and they communicate through a Zigbee network. They are whitelisted to a switch, and only if you are whitelisted, you can control and command them. Of course, you want that you should be able to control them, and you do not want your neighbors to end up controlling your own lighting devices. However, the authors came up with a very interesting attack against this IoT system. So the first step of this attack was to kind of play around with its firmware. So they basically took hold physically of one of these bulbs in these buildings and showed that you can essentially reset the firmware to disable their proximity detector. And in the second part of the attack, they showed that using a specific feature of over-the-air update, you can essentially allow one bulb to communicate to the other bulbs and try to kind of control them or command them as you wish. However, during this OTA or over-the-air update, there is an inherent cryptographic algorithm that essentially tries to secure the communication. So what is underneath is basically an 128-bit AES-based counter mode message authentication code. And therefore, if you cannot really, inject any packet because it will be detected. So therefore, the security of this relies on the 128-bit secret key. So what the attackers did was they kind of took hold of one of these bulbs and tried to perform a specific kind of side channel attack, which I will try to brief during my presentation, which is called as differential power attacks. Using the differential technique, they show how they can recover the 128-bit key. And once they recover the 128-bit key, they can virtually, pump in any data, which is essentially allowed by the other bulbs. So that way they showed a very nice work where they showed that IoT can really go nuclear. And even for a city as big as, say, Paris, you can essentially, create, darken the entire city by infecting only around, say, 16,000 bulbs. And there is a very nice YouTube, if you are interested, YouTube video, if you're interested, you can have a look, where they show that how they fly a drone and using that they control and command these bulbs and display an SOS on the buildings. So this experiment shows that side channels for IoT devices are very crucial because many of these devices are at our homes and are at the disposal of the attacker. So how do we protect them? So if we think that cryptography can solve them, then we do not really understand cryptography, and we also do not understand the problem. Because many of these attacks essentially do not target the cryptographic algorithm, but they target the corresponding implementation. So strong cryptographic algorithms are just the beginning. They're a very important beginning, but they're not the end. So here is an example of a card accepting device and a smart card. And when you are exchanging information and protecting the data by a cryptographic algorithm, so far the guarantees hold. However, in real life, there may be information leakage sources, maybe the power supply, which can virtually read out the key. So we need protection against these kind of attacks. Luckily, our credit cards indeed now have protections against such kind of attack vectors. So what are side channels? So side channels are basically information sources through which through which your cryptographic algorithm can leak the secret key or such kind of secret information. Often these implementations are because of optimizations. So it could be an if-else statement in your programming language, which depends upon the secret key. So there are, in real life, different side channel sources. So for example, we have been largely dealing with cryptographic algorithms, but there are other important components in security as well. For example, the threat model and the security goal, the protocol, your software designs, hardware designs, deployment and usage, and finally the human users. So it can be safely said that it is impossible to design a totally secure system with humans in it. So we will not even try for that. Rather, while traditionally we were only handling cryptographic algorithms, we will be focusing on software designs and also hardware design. In software, we have often key-dependent variations, computation time variations, which can leak information. In hardware, we can have power consumptions, EM radiations, behavior under faults, which can also compromise the secret. In recent days, you will see that the margin or the gap between software and hardware is also gradually narrowing down. So many of the attack vectors which are possible on software can also be mounted on hardware and also vice versa. So here is sort of an example to understand what are power-based side channel attacks. So in particular, we know like AES is a worldwide standard, advanced encryption standard, and the version of AES 128 has got 10 rounds of encryption. So the first graph on the left, you can see here that virtually you can read out the 10 rounds just by observing the power trace. So this trace has been accumulated in our laboratory, and you can virtually read out that there are 10 rounds in the encryption process. So this variation of the or dependence of the power on the underlying operation is what we call as simple power analysis. Now there is a more sophisticated attack, which is called as differential power attack, which tries to exploit the fact that power also depends upon the underlying data. Now this is a very difficult attack to counter and also to protect. So this line of research was started by this famous paper from Kocher and his colleagues at Crypto in '99, and now is a separate sub-discourse in itself. So this attack or differential power attack is so powerful that it can virtually compromise any crypto system. For instance, like which doesn't have any countermeasure. So for example, this graph shows you that suppose we take AES 128, you can recover the key using something like around 15,000 power traces or even less than that. So in this particular example, we show that 1 byte of the key has been recovered, and you can see that after some statistical processing, this particular key manifests itself and shows some spikes which are distinguishable, and hence you can understand the key byte in a separate. So these attacks are largely following to the class of divide and conquer attacks, and therefore even if there are 16 bytes or 120 bits in the key, you can recover the key in a byte by byte fashion. So how does this attack work? So I will try to give a very simple illustration of this the working principle of differential power attack, which are more specifically called as correlation power attacks or CPA. So in this class of attack, you try to kind of recover the key byte by byte. So for instance, right, let me take an example of the AES 128 and try to draw it down. Suppose, like we have got these bytes of the AES 128, 120 bit key, which is arranged in this fashion of 4 × 4. So every every element here is a byte. So suppose I want to recover this byte of the key. So now this byte of the key can have 256 values. So these are called as the key hypothesis. So what you do basically is you take all the plain text same. You can also work it from the cipher text, but let us say assume that we are trying to operate from the plain text, and you try to kind of go ahead and perform some kind of intermediate cryptographic operation. So when you come to the intermediate state, you essentially are coming to a state, intermediate state, which we called as say and you try to kind of predict the power consumption by using your favorite power model. So these power models could be simple as simple as maybe the Hamming weight of the byte. So once you have got the hypothetical power, so remember that this hypothetical power depended upon the key hypothesis that you made, right? Here you made a key hypothesis, and based on the key hypothesis, you extract out a hypothetical power. You also have the real power trace which you have accumulated, which is the observation that you have, and you try to correlate them. Okay, so if your correlation is strong and is stronger compared to another key hypothesis, then you give more vote for that key hypothesis, and that way you try to kind of narrow down your search space and eventually identify the correct key for for this specific byte. So likewise, you can do this attack on the other bytes as well. And therefore, right, since this attack is of divide and conquer nature, you essentially can imagine that even if I increase the key length, the attacks will still be working and effectively working. So this is a very simple, I would say, like a very high level description of how the attack works. In real life, there are more complications. And of course, we need to understand how to handle them. So there can be another overview or looking at perspective of looking at it, which is from the information theoretic perspective. Okay. So imagine that there is a cryptographic device, which is essentially operating, say, an integrated circuit. You have an input and there is an embedded key. Okay. And you try to kind of process it. And because of this processing, so this process could be something, like maybe, like an S box. So an S box is an example of a cryptographic primitive where there is a nonlinear transformation which is being done on, say, the input as well as the key, and you perform some kind of Boolean operation. Okay. So now the idea is that because of this computation, the internal transistors, start to switch. So they go from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. And because of that, there is an internal power consumption in the device. Now, when you're observing, remember that you have got maybe a probe or some kind of measuring device, but you are not able to exactly observe, right? Because there is a noise that gets embedded because of several other, like electrical phenomena. So we call this as electrical noise, okay? So therefore, you can imagine that the observation that you have can be split up roughly into two channels, okay? One, which actually does the computation and the actual power consumption or side channel consumption. And there is another measurement noise, which is also another channel, okay? So once you have this observable, you essentially can frame this problem in an information theoretic sense. So what you essentially can do is you can imagine that based upon your favorite powered model, so let us assume that you have got a Hamming weight powered model. That means you are looking at the value of a byte. Now, a value of an internal byte can take 0 to 255 possible values. But when your power model is Hamming weight, then you can imagine that the Hamming weight of a byte can vary from 0 to 8. Okay. So there can be, say, 9 Hamming classes, or you can call them as the leakage bins. Okay. So as you can see here, these are the leakage bins. And you can now take your input X and you can start distributing them among these bins. Okay. So note that this distribution will depend upon the key guess that you make. Okay. So just like in the previous illustration, you try to guess on a byte. In this case also, when you are making your guess, depending upon that, your input gets distributed in these bins. Okay. And after this distribution, you try to kind of estimate this conditional probability. What is this conditional probability? It is PO given Li. That means when you're observing, say, O, you want to find out what is PO given Li. That means given this leakage, what is your probability that you are getting some observable. Okay. And you also can find out the probability of your observable. And using these two, you try to measure what is the mutual information of O and of your actual leakage. Now note that the leakage also depends upon the secret key. Okay. Then the hypothesis is this, that is, the correct key will try to kind of maximize this mutual information because your observable O is actually corresponding to your actual key. And therefore, right, your information or mutual information should be maximized for the correct key guess. Okay. And therefore, right, this essentially leaks the key. So this is, like an information theoretic overview of side channels. And, like one can show that the statistical attacks that we do are asymptotically equivalent to this kind of information theoretic framework. So this brings me to another class of side channels, which are called as fault-based cryptanalysis. So in fault-based cryptanalysis, one tries to exploit the fact that the fault or the behavior of the fault in a crypto device can also compromise your secrets. So for example, let's take a plain text and do it or obtain a normally fault-free ciphertext. But in the second time, when you are again doing an encryption, let us change the environment a bit. Okay. For example, it could be because of a clock glitch. It could be because of an EM shoot. It could be a laser shoot. And you try to create some, like faults inside your circuit. And you get a faulty ciphertext. Okay. So in normal common sense, right, we'll probably think that, okay, there is a fault. Let me repeat the process and go ahead. But one should be careful to note that a single revelation of the faulty ciphertext can end up in compromising your secret. So let us see how. Okay. By taking this example of the popular AES algorithm. So in this particular slide, we show the last few rounds of the AES. Imagine that there is a fault that has been created during the encryption. Okay. So far, so good. But when this fault propagates down the encryption process, you will find because of the underlying operations, there are nice interrelationships which are created by the faults. As you can see here, if you observe, like this state or maybe this state, you'll find out that there are nice interrelationships. So now what the attacker tries to do, the attacker tries to guess this last few rounds of the key and go back and exploit these interrelationships. Okay, and research shows that a single fault is enabled to reduce the AES key size from 2 to the power of 128, which is extremely large, to only 2 to the power of 8 values, which is extremely low. Okay, and in fact, a double shot at the fault, okay, can reveal the key in a unique fashion. Okay, so this shows that fault attacks can be really catastrophic for even the standard crypto systems. In fact, fault attacks can also be used to break countermeasures. Okay, so in one of our recent works, we tried to look at a protected design of a cipher, which is called as present. And there is a very popular way of protecting them against side channel, which is based on the theory of multi-party computations and secret sharing. So the idea here is that you take an input and you try to kind of, break it up into shares, and each of these shares essentially are statistically independent of the actual data. So when you process on the shares and you never combine the shares, okay, so you essentially end up in ensuring that the power consumption remains statistically independent of the actual data. So now what we try to do is we try to launch a fault attack on it, and it is one of the first reported fault attacks on such a crypto system. And we showed that we took a multi-cycle implementation of the TI or threshold implementation and showed that when the faults are targeted on these masks, and you try to observe that after certain operations, that whether it results in a faulty output or not. Okay, so using this, you create a fault template, and eventually, once you have created the fault template in the actual attack instance, you try to kind of inject a similar fault and see that whether your template matches. Interestingly, if you read the paper, you will see that even in such cases, even with such protections, like the key gets diverged because of the fault injections. So this brings us to this question: can we really make fault-tolerant architectures? Okay. In fact, there are several countermeasures which have been proposed, largely based on redundancy. However, it is like a bigger question: how do you evaluate a countermeasure? And it is an industrial of relevance, because in industry, one doesn't really want to divulge the countermeasure techniques, but still wants to get some kind of guarantee that whether they are safe against such kind of lethal attack techniques. So in one of our recent works, we try to develop a technique using statistical ideas. So the idea here is illustrated by this diagram. So you can see here we kind of take our protected cipher and inject it to two faults, okay, say maybe based on the fault model that we have. And then we observe the output differential, and then we try to kind of feed it to a statistical hypothesis testing tool, which could be a simple student t-test, and try to see that whether these two distributions essentially differ. The idea of this particular form of analysis is based on the non-interference theory, which essentially tries to give us a guarantee that the output differential and the fault, or the output differential and the secret key, are not leaking any mutual information. Okay, and using this, we try to get some kind of statistical guarantee of the or confidence that our designs are secured against such kind of fault attacks. In fact, in recent work, we also try to develop a framework using deep learning techniques, which is also based on similar ideas. So in this case, we take an encryption, we again subject it to two types of faults, and we create a data set. So then we apply a k-fold cross validation and try to kind of train a machine learning tool. The idea being is that if your machine learning tool is able to kind of learn and essentially show differ, and understand that whether the data sets belongs to the class of F0 or whether it belongs to the class of F1 with a probability which is significantly more than or better than 0.5, then that means that there is a potential information leakage. So using this framework, we try to evaluate several countermeasures. In fact, one of the countermeasures, which is kind of broken in a chess paper, we showed that our detection framework is able to really detect it without really going into the internal details of the working principles of the countermeasure. So finally, right, we try to kind of package all these tools into a into a tool that we call as ESP Anveshak. So the idea of this tool is that it's a tool which is built on open source platform and try to kind of analyze your side channel as well as fault attack countermeasure of your design. Okay. So before we go into the second part, here is a quick tour of the side channel analysis set up at our laboratory. So I'll just play it. Hopefully it works. Yeah, so this is more or less a video to show us give an overview on the side channel setup and how it works in real life. So this brings me to the part 2 of my talk. So where I would like to talk about microarchitectural attacks. So to essentially, as opposed to the previous attack vectors that we have seen, which largely tries to focus on the hardware implementations and also on maybe on embedded implementations. So this class of attacks can also be extended to more general purpose computing systems. So this tries to address the gap between hardware and software. And I would like to say that microarchitecture attacks tries to exploit vulnerabilities in various processor design methodologies, which have evolved over the years. For example, when Meltdown and Spectre was developed, right, essentially it kind of shook the world and showed us that what we have evolved for 20 years essentially were put into question. And fixing them is often very difficult because it could either result in a major performance hit, or it is potentially impossible because we need to kind of re-architecture several components which have evolved for the last 20 years or so. So how do you really, secure them is $1 million question, and therefore it is important to mind this gap and develop holistic approach which are needed for building secure systems. So one should keep in mind that once you develop a bad, hardware, okay, after that, whatever you are doing your designs on, right, essentially can remain unsafe, even if you are using the best of cryptographic techniques. So we need a good solution. So in order to kind of stress these points, I will try to kind of elaborate on certain research findings that we have actually came down our, journey. So I will start with this work that we developed or worked with Entity Labs in Japan, where we showed where we looked at, some kind of timing attacks that were working on block ciphers. So microarchitectural leakages can be because of, as I mentioned, are due to the underlying computer architecture, and it can be because of several hardware artifacts. It could be because of the branch predictors, hyperthreading, memory technologies, and so on. But more importantly here, we try to focus first on the cache attacks. And these attacks are also are more relevant for attacks on software or embedded crypto systems due to the underlying hardware design. Okay. So what is essentially a timing attack first? So let me try to kind of illustrate a timing attack by this example where, and I'll give you a very quick quick read into this. So this is basically based on the famous paper from Kochard in 1996, where he showed how a timing attack works. So in this class of attacks, we try to kind of target, crypto systems where the crypto systems are, say, let us consider an RSA kind of crypto system, which basically takes input, say, Y, and takes a secret data X, and it performs Y power of X modulo M. So often when we try to implement them, the classic way of implementing them would be using a square and multiply technique. So the idea here is that there is a bit, you kind of expect, write your exponent X in a bit by bit fashion. And the idea is that if that bit is 1, then you perform an additional multiplication, else you only perform a squaring operation. So this attack, or rather the timing attack, tries to kind of show the attack in an iterative manner. The idea being that you suppose as an attacker x0 to xb minus 2, you want to predict what is the value of xb minus 1. Now, without any side channel information, the probability of guessing xb minus 1 is 0.5. Using side channels or timing observations, we want to do better than that. So how does it work? So in order to do that, we need a very accurate timing measurement. So for this, we use, dedicated timestamp counters, which are built using certain, certain registers, which are known popularly as this RDTSC timestamp counter. So we basically, put this RDTSC timestamp evaluation at the beginning of a process and after the process, and using that, we get accurate measurements of the corresponding timing. So now the question is that the attacker wants to kind of observe several statistical observations. Now, what the attacker does is it basically varies this input Y. Remember that the secret doesn't vary, the secret remains constant, and observes the timing of all these decryption processes. Now, if you say that the jth observation, can be depicted by, say, a timing Tj. So now this timing Tj, you can think of being, suppose your exponent is, say, from 0 to W I minus 1, and every bit that you are processing takes, T1, T2, or so on. So that the overall time, right, will be a summation of these individual timings. So now what you try to do is you try to do a math. So this math is very simple. What you try to do is you try to kind of, remember that the attacker knows the keys from 0 to B minus 2. but it doesn't only know the value of the b minus 1th key bit, right? And therefore the attacker guesses, and the guess can be either a 0 or can either be a 1. And then the attacker also finds out, like the timing for processing, say 0 to b minus 1. Note that out of which 0 to b minus 2 are correct, but the b minus 1th bit is, since it is dependent upon the guess, it can be either correct or it can be also wrong. And then it basically finds out the difference of these two timings. And you can observe that if you observe the difference between these two timings, then you will essentially find that many of these terms will get cancelled out, except a component, which essentially is shown here by this delta TB minus 1. So now what the attacker does is, since it gets these distributions called as TR, it calculates the variance of these two distributions. And one can observe here very quickly that if your guess was correct, then the variance term, and you compared with the variance when the guess was wrong, you will find out that there is an additional term here, which is shown here is 2 times something. Okay, but the point to be noted here is that when your guess is correct versus when your guess is wrong, the variance increases when you're wrong, when your guess is wrong. Okay, and therefore the attacker, if it is able to measure this difference of timing and from there estimates the variance and finds out the variance is increasing, it tries to understand that it gets a significant amount of I would say hint to know what is the corresponding secret bit. Okay, and since the attack is an iterative attack, so you can imagine that even if you have got a 1024-bit key, you essentially can recover it in a bit-by-bit fashion. So this is the basic broad idea behind timing attacks. And one can also extend these timing attacks to block ciphers. And here comes the context of the cache memories. Okay, so if you quickly remember what we have studied in our undergraduate computer organization classes, we have got your main memory and your microprocessor. We know that there is a memory wall, and in order to breach the memory wall, we have got this cache memory. So we know that if there is a cache hit, the access time is less compared to when there is a cache miss. So now the question is, there is a timing difference. Can we exploit this timing difference? The adversary wants to know what is Bob's secret key, exploiting this timing difference. Okay. So why does a cache hit or a cache miss information reveal the secret key? So let us try to understand the working principle. So imagine that we have got a cipher, and the cipher has got 2 parts of the key, say K0 and K4. So you can imagine that as an example, like suppose you have got AES and there are 16 bytes of the key. Imagine that there are 2 bytes that we are looking at, the 0th byte and the 4th byte. Okay. So imagine that since both of them are bytes, right? Ideally, each of them should have an 8-bit of entropy, and revelation or knowledge about one of the parts should not reveal any information about the other part. They should be kind of independent. However, in real life or in this context, if you find out that there is a cache hit, remember that these implementations of ciphers are often done through a lot of table accesses. If you open up a software implementation, you will see that there are a lot of table accesses being done, and therefore the memory comes into play, and hence the cache memory comes into play. Okay. So now if you think that there is a cache hit, that means the address at which you are accessing the table for the first access and the address at which you are accessing the second table, there is a match. And therefore, you can derive equations of this nature, which shows say P0 XOR with K0 is same or similar as that of P4 XOR K4. And therefore, you can develop relationships among these key bytes. So that means that if you know one part of this key, you can know the other part of the key, because the plain text is also known to you as an adversary. And therefore, the entropy of the key reduces, and this leads to the attacks. Okay. So there is another, a class of attack which was due to the famous work by Oswick and Shamir and other people, which showed how an attack works when you have got a co-deciding process. So imagine that there is a cloud server and there is an AES and SPI which are operating on the same hardware. So first the SPI comes in, fills up the addresses of the microprocessor and accesses some random memory locations, and because of which, right, it essentially fills up the cache. Now, when the access goes back to the AES essentially performs the encryption, and therefore, evicts certain regions from the cache memory. Next time when the SPI comes back, it can observe the timing difference, and that can tell us that, what was the footprint of the AES operation. And therefore, right, using the previous equations that we have derived, you can essentially trivially reduce the key entropy. So this is like one class of attacks which are called as the cache access attack. And there is another class of attack which also became very popular, which was due to Bernstein, and it's called as cache timing attacks. So these attacks were more popular because potentially they can work even on the network. So imagine that, so this is again from a classic textbook. So the execution time will depend upon the hit times and the miss times of your cache memory. And imagine that, suppose, like there is a remote attacker and there is a server which is running an encryption software, and there is a remote attacker which basically sends over the network, maybe a TCP network, sends packets, gets back the data, but also measures the timing which is required for the encryption process. So how does that timing, right, reveal information about the secret? So in order to understand this, let us try to understand what is Bernstein's cache timing experiment. So in this experiment, you imagine that you have got the AES block cipher, and again, there are 16 bytes, and the plain text, therefore, you can imagine that also has got 16 bytes, okay? So what you do in this attack is you fix one of the bytes to some specific value. Say, for example, P0 is your byte. You fix that to some value, say 00, and for the other parts, you give some random variation, okay? And what you observe is also a separate timings for each of these encryptions. You find out the average time for, for the value of the chosen value of the P0 byte, okay? Next, you again change the value of P0 to something else, and again repeat this experiment. If you keep on changing the values of P0 to all the 256 possible values, remember it's a byte, you will get a characteristic which is shown over here, okay? And interestingly, if you put this key to all 0 value, do this experiment, repeat this with another unknown value, you will find out that these two timing graphs, there is a slight shift, and that shift essentially corresponds to the secret key. Okay, so if you correlate these two results, you can essentially obtain the secret key. So this essentially, the reason why you get the correlation is because all the keys are equivalent stochastically, and therefore, right, you will just find out that statistically the point at which you get the maximum for the first one and the second one, if you interrelate, that interrelation is because of the XOR of the corresponding keys. So therefore, why does cache attacks work on AES? And largely, right, one of the reasons is because of how you implement the ciphers. So these ciphers, if we look into, say, a standard OpenSSL package or any other crypto software library, you will find that they're often implemented using table lookups. For instance, in OpenSSL, there are 4 table lookups, which essentially each of them have got around 1 kilobyte, and you can essentially perform AES in a very fast manner using these table lookups. So since they are essentially using these table lookups, they essentially bring the cache into play. So we basically took, say, a 4 kilobyte table, which is a standard implementation, and try to find out what is the difference of timing that you get. And it will not take you much time to understand. The difference of time will depend upon the number of misses, okay, in the cache memory. And therefore, right, if you do a simple experiment, you'll find that there is a nice distribution of the number of misses, which you can try to exploit in your attack. So the natural question is that, can I implement the AES using a smaller table? If you do that, right, you will find out the number of cache misses becomes roughly a constant, because it's a small table. The moment you start the encryption after a few rounds, the entire cache, or the entire table gets loaded into the cache, and after this, everything is a hit. So you get roughly a constant number of cache misses, and therefore, right, it was widely believed that it is more difficult to perform cache attacks against such kind of implementations. Okay, and indeed, right, when you do an attack, you find a very less deviations, which looks almost like noise. So there was a paper which essentially tried to claim that it is believed to be difficult to attack against, such kind of small S boxes. And this is essentially one of the projects that we had to see that whether they are really, secured against cache attacks. So there are different kind of techniques which the processor essentially employs. I mean, I will not go into all of them, but in particular, I will try to kind of highlight a technique which is essentially often important in the case of block ciphers, which essentially the processor supports, which is called as out of order loading. So if you see how the block cipher operates, you will find out that each of the block cipher or inside one round, there are several SBox accesses or lookup tables that you do, which are independent of each other. And therefore, you can execute them in an out of order fashion. Whereas if you go from round 1 to round 2, there is a dependence. So you cannot really, process the round 2 lookups before you have done the round 1 operations, because there is a dependence. Okay. So therefore, right, I mean, this, brings in the parallelization and the overlapping, which are there in our modern processors, which tries to kind of, play around with the overall timing. Now, there is a feature in modern processors, which tries to kind of, perform pipelining in the memory reads. And therefore, right, one of the objectives of this is to kind of ensure that if there are 2 or more cache misses, you can service them simultaneously if there is no dependence. So what is the effect of this on a cipher execution? So consider that there is a 5 rounds of block cipher with 4 misses, okay, which is shown here as E1. But if you see the distribution, you will find that the first round has got 2 cache misses, the second round has got 1 cache miss, and the third round also has got a cache miss of 1. If you consider another run of this cipher, so you remember that it is a, like a small table S box or small table cipher, and therefore I am imagining that in both the encryptions, they are the number of cache misses remain the same. In the first operation, there were 4 cache misses. In the second operation, also there are 4 cache misses. However, the distribution is different. So can the distribution play around or affect the timing? It indeed can, because of the the reason that I just now mentioned. So in the first case, you will find out that there are 2 cache misses in the first round. However, they are independent, because in the first round, all the table lookups that you are doing are independent of each other, and therefore they can be serviced in parallel. And therefore, the timing of E1 will be lesser than the timing of E2. And note that there is a reason why essentially the timing of E1 is lesser than the timing of E2. So it is not random, or it is not something that is just happening without any reason. So in order to understand this, we tried to kind of also look into some of the internals of the cache memory. And one of the important blocks that we found out was the hardware prefetcher. So in the cache memory, there are many kind of features, in particular the hardware prefetcher, which tries to detect various kind of access patterns. So it could be the stripes, it could be the sequences, based on which it kind of prefetches information. And therefore, right, if you consider a cipher and imagine that, remember the timing characteristic that I showed, and we initially fixed a value of the P0, and that P0 essentially whatever you're accessing at the first memory access influences the access patterns later on. And this creates, like a probability distribution, which potentially, essentially, is the reason of those nice, leakages that we see. So, in order to understand this, we try to look into 2 important prefetching techniques. One of them is called as the sequential prefetching. So, in sequential prefetching, in a very top level, the idea is that if you're accessing certain pattern, then the next access or next line gets accessed. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind sequential prefetching. Likewise, there is another prefetching which is called as the arbitrary stride prefetcher, which tries to see whether there is an access pattern. Like if there is a, like an arithmetic progression, for example, in your access pattern, then it kind of goes ahead and, prefetches blocks so that it can be used subsequently. So we try to understand what is the effect of this on the probability of a cache hit when there is a prefetching. Okay. So imagine that there is a cache memory with some prefetching strategy, say P, it could be the sequential prefetcher, it could be the arbitrary stride prefetcher. And imagine that the nth access, whether it results in a hit or miss, you denote that by some kind of random variable. Okay. And you find out, depending on whether there is a collision, which means that is something that will happen in a classical cache, whether there is no prefetching, versus when there is a, no collision, but still the prefetching results in a. So we basically try to find out this distribution, and we try to kind of estimate these probability values. So therefore, right, it will not take you much to understand that in the case of a classical cache where there is no prefetching, whatever value you are setting at the beginning, right, at the first, remember the P0 value will not influence anything subsequently. But on the contrary, if there is prefetching, then there will be an influence. Okay. So what we try to do is we try to kind of, therefore analyze this prefetching probabilities, and from there try to find out the expected value of the number of cache misses and also the variance of the distribution. So once you get that, you will be in a position to find out or predict the timing characteristic. And we found out that for most of our experimental setups, our predictions matches very well with the timing characteristics that we obtain in real life experiments. Okay, so this is a paper that we recently published in the Journal of Cryptology, and we show that prefetching has got a very strong influence on the timing characteristic and also on the leakage. In particular, I would like to mention that if your prefetching was not enabled, then you wouldn't have got this nice curve. Okay, and therefore, right, you will not essentially, right, it will not leak. So this is one example where it shows that because of a modern feature, which is called as the prefetcher, there is an information leakage. So therefore, to summarize, on modern caches, execution time not only depends on the number of misses, but it also depends on the distribution of misses. Okay, and prefetching causes variations in the timing profile, and the distribution of miss depends on the key. So the execution time in turn also depends upon the key. So therefore, using these ideas, we were able to perform an attack on the Clefia, which was essentially a cipher designed by Sony, which was built on small S boxes and showed that an attack around 300 seconds can be used to recover the entire 128-bit secret key. Interestingly, our attack doesn't work on Pentium 3. Probably one of the reasons is because these modern features were not enabled on this processor. So this brings me to the last part of my talk, which is essentially on the modern times, and I will be very quick on this part. Okay, so let us quickly look into two important attack vectors that we have recently found out, and we have been working on for a while. The first one is on an asymmetric key encryption, and we know that one of the most popular recent forms of public key algorithms are what are called as the elliptic curve crypto system, which are largely dependent on finding out an elliptic curve operation based on certain operations which are called as additions and doublings, and based upon that you want to find out or get the scalar product of k with p, where k is a secret. Now, as I mentioned, if you remember at the beginning, right, the theory says that it is very difficult to obtain from Q and P the value of K. It is a problem which is often called as the elliptic curve discrete log problem. But in real life, when you're implementing them, there are several So for example, if you implement it in this fashion, you will find out there is an if statement which depends upon the secret key. There is another way of implementing this scalar multiplication also, which is called as a Montgomery ladder, where essentially we also still have these if statements and now these if statements, so in your processor, you have got branch prediction units, which tries to kind of predict the branches, and based upon that, it tries to kind of, resolve some the branch misses. Okay. So this is exactly what we try to attack in the, and we show here a very simplistic overview of the attack. So in order to start the attack, we try to kind of make a guess of what is the internal predictor. So note that, of course, we do not know because the predictors also are pretty complex. So we came up with a very simple guess, which is called as a 2-bit predictor or a 3-bit predictor, which is a very standard, or I would say a textbook representation of how a branch predictor can be built. And then we try to kind of correlate the output of these branch predictors with the actual branch predictors that you get on, standard systems, which are, say, designed by Intel or AMD or so on. And we found out that there is a very strong correlation. In fact, if you go into the newer processors like Intel Core i3 and beyond, you will still find a very strong correlation with 2-bit and 3-bit saturating counters. So the question is, right, how can we exploit them for attacking public key crypto systems? In fact, we target 1024-bit RSA, 256-bit ECC with protections like Montgomery ladder. And again, we show subsequently that we can still use them to even break designs with side channel countermeasures. So to start with, in Montgomery ladder, you essentially have got a statement structure like this, where you essentially perform, both addition and doubling in both the branches of your computation. And it is one of the most popular exponentiation primitive for asymmetric key crypto systems. If you go down, you'll find out that there are internal multiplications, and these multiplications are implemented by a technique which is called as Montgomery multiplication. So the idea of a Montgomery multiplication in a very simple manner is to perform a Montgomery reduction, which basically does a transformation, and then finally, right, it computes the result in that transform domain. So when you go into look into the Montgomery reduction code, you will find out that there is an if statement as shown over here, which essentially is what we target in our attack. So if you go to the Montgomery ladder as shown over here, this is the if statement that we try to attack. Why we target the if statement is because the if statements influence how the branch prediction works, right? Because these are the corresponding branch statements. So in order to understand this, with the value of the branch misses, we resort to certain artifacts which are called as hardware performance counters, or HPCs, which are nothing but a set of special purpose registers which are present in most of the modern microprocessors to give us guarantees of various kind of observations. It can give us the branch misses, the cache misses, instruction retired, and so on. So what we try to see is that whether these statistics, where we try to look into these performance counter values and try to see that whether we can potentially do attacks. So there are various ways in which you can work on these perf handlers. So I would like to say that you can sample them in an asynchronous manner, which means that there can be a process which can trigger a scalar multiplication, but it doesn't communicate with the scalar multiplication, but it just observes the number of perf values. So it could be the branch misses, for instance. Now, Slightly being optimistic, you can also have two processes which are completely independent of each other, and you try to kind of observe the branch misses sitting in one process while your actual computation is taking place in another process. So here is a very simplistic overview of that. See, when the branch scalar multiplication takes place, there is a sudden increase in the branch misses, which tells you the exact period on which to launch the attack. So now the question is, right, whether you can break existing DPA countermeasures. Now there are various countermeasures that have been proposed to protect against side channels. So in particular, I will try to take your attention towards this technique, which is called a scalar splitting. So suppose I want to calculate K into P. So what you do here is you split the K into two parts by a random value, say R, and you call that as K minus R and R. So rather than calculating K into P, you calculate K minus RP separately, and you calculate RPs in a separate process. Okay. The idea being that if you even if you are doing your side channel attack and you get K minus R, or you are getting R, you don't get any information about the value of the K. But in our attack, we try to develop a methodology which is called as acquire, deduce, and remove, which basically tries to observe several instances of these computations of K minus R, and tries to kind of interrelate them. The idea being that if you are essentially observing it over several observations, then K minus R, and you say, suppose you recover, say P bits of K minus R and P bits of R, and then you combine them, each of the time you are doing your computations, it will result in the same value of K, because K minus R plus R in all the instances should give you the same value of K. Okay, and therefore, right, you can really perform, like techniques like majority voting and so on to increase the confidence of your guess on the value of the scalar. Okay, so using this, we were able to attack, like curve 1174, which is the standard implementation of elliptic curve over something like around 10,000 traces. So this paper you can see is published in IIITC, and if you are interested, you can look into this reference for more details. So I will come to the final part of my presentation, which is on a new attack that we, propose, and we call it as wrestle. So wrestle essentially stands for wrestle. Okay, and in this case, there is a wrestling that happens between the operating system scheduler and the processor architecture. So I will try to give an overview behind how this attack works. So in particular, this is one of the first works which tries to look into the underlying scheduler and tries to see what are the security implications of that. In particular, if you look into a type of scheduler which is called as a deadline scheduler, which is very popular in the real-time operating systems or embedded system domain, and even for general purpose servers, you will find out one of the objective of this scheduler is to automatically preempt a process from the CPU after its requested expiration time. Now, there are different parameters which you can set in the deadline scheduler. Interesting part is that so far, you just need a capsys permission to access them, okay? And therefore, you do not need a root privilege to access them. If you compare it with the previous attack vectors, like the performance counter-based attacks that we showed, initially they were, we had user privilege to that, but after several findings of the attacks that we showed, now there is a restriction. You cannot access the performance counter values from the user privilege. And therefore, right, and there is another observation that I would like to also mention, that you can try to kind of, do away with the branch statements or write the code in a manner where there are no explicit if-else statements. So does the attacks go away if you do that? So here I will talk about an attack technique which works irrespective of the way, irrespective of the fact that whether you do not have explicit branch statements in your program code. So how does it work? So in order to start with, first we tinkered with the deadline scheduler and try to set the parameters so that essentially, we try to exploit this fact that because of the parameters that you set in the scheduler, the entire encryption does not take place at once, but rather it kind of gets preempted after a specific time interval. And therefore, right, there is another process that kind of tries to interplay with your encryption code and tries to steal the key. So let's see how it works. So this is one piece of the attack puzzle, which is essentially the your operating system scheduler. The other piece of this attack is what is called as a return address stack. Okay, so what is a return address stack? The return address stack, as opposed to your software stack, is an explicit hardware stack that your architecture provides. The idea being is that if you have got several return statements, like you are making your function calls, the processor must predict the return address. Okay, now note that if you are using the normal page table, you cannot do that because the page table largely depends upon history. But when you are calling, say, the functions from several points, you do not really have any history, okay? And therefore, in order to reduce the number of branch misses, the processor provides you this hardware stack, which is called as the return address stack, where the next pointer, like if you see this function call, which is, for example, done at this address, you will find that the corresponding return address is stored in the return address, okay? Likewise, when you are making the next function call, you do so this is maintained in a LIFO or a last in, first out manner, and therefore, right, the previous address goes in and the next address comes over and gets stored in the stack, in this return address stack. So what is the, so now if you imagine that there is a nesting of function calls that you do, okay? So imagine that you do several nestings of the function calls. So that will imply that the corresponding return addresses will start pushing into the stack one by one. And eventually, since this return address stack is finite in nature, so typically we found out that for most systems, it is around 16. You'll find out that, say, suppose you have got 17, like nestings, then after some time, you will find out that the corresponding return address gets removed from the stack, okay? So this is called as the overflow condition. Now, if there are several overflows that takes place, then eventually all the addresses become stale, and that is what we call as an underflow. So now what we try to do is, we try to do an experiment to do a reverse engineering to understand what is the size of the stack. So initially, right, you can play around with this, and you will find out that the point, right, where, and you can play around with the number of nesting calls that you do in the function. So typically, right, we found out that if your number of nested function calls goes beyond 16, you will find that there is an increase in the time. As you can see here, when you go from the 16 to 17 region, there is an increase or shoot up of the time. So that means, right, at this point, you get an overflow of the stack, and therefore, right, it shows us that, that the size of the stack is 16, okay? And the next question is that whether you can exploit it to develop an attack. So the first attack that we try to develop is a covert channel. So imagine that there are two processes which are apparently, isolated from each other. And one of the process essentially creates this configuration of the stack, which means, it fills up the stack by having this nested, nested function calls, maybe 16, nested function calls. So that means the stack, the return address stack that we have is, filled up. So now you come to, the next process, which is essentially the sender, and the sender, depending upon, a secret bit, it basically makes a function call, or it does not make a function call. So that means the moment it makes a function call, the underflow is created here. And therefore, right, when the receiver process times it or measures the timing, it sees that there is an increase in time. And therefore, it knows that the secret bit which the sender wants to send is, like a 1, for example. So this you can apply, and this illustration shows you that you can recover the entire secret, or you can communicate the entire secret over a covert channel. There is no explicit communication, but just by timing observation, one can communicate this through a covert channel. The next question was, can we really apply it for a side channel attack? Okay, in particular, we try to see that whether it can be used to recover the signing key of OpenASL elliptic curve digital signatures for P256 curve. So the first thing that was important is to get the synchronization to work with the deadline scheduler. And so the attack has got two phases. The first phase is an online phase, where it performs a targeted recovery of a fraction of the MSB. Note that in a signature scheme, you do not have a constant key, but you have got the nonces, okay? And every time you are developing or doing a signing, you are doing a signing with a nonce, and the nonce is randomly chosen. So therefore, in the online phase, we essentially have got a single shot to recover at least few bits of the key. And in the second phase, using this partial nonces, we try to exploit a dedicated lattice-based cryptanalytic technique, and from there try to entirely obtain the 256-bit key. So the first thing, before you go into the online phase, there is a previous phase or previous learning phase, which we call as a template building phase. So in the template building phase, say in our case, we want to recover say few bits of the nonce, say L bits, or in our case, it was 6 bits that we wanted to recover. And you try to, guess this 2 to the power of L bits, and there are, 2 to the power of L possibilities for that. And for each of them, you try to kind of run your victim process and you want to find the timing. So the idea is that there is a victim process and there is a Russell spy, which essentially has created that condition of the return address stack that I just mentioned in context of the covert channel. Now, when the victim essentially comes into play, remember that you have essentially set the deadline scheduler in a manner so that only a single scalar of the or a single bit computation of the of your digital signature process essentially is executed by the CPU. And after that, the process relinquishes the CPU and the control comes back to the spy process. So this synchronization is performed, or we are able to do that because we are able to set the parameters of the scheduler so that this nice synchronization happens. But remember again, like that, this can be done at the user privilege using a capsys NIS, and you do not need a root privilege to do that. And once you do that, you can get accurate templates. And using these templates, you can, perform a template matching to obtain few bits of the secret. So I would rather, quickly come at the results here. So the result shows, for example, that you essentially can perform in the matching phase with around 500 nonces. We were able to find out that 6 bits of the key remains in the first 5 ranks of your observations. And in the second phase, you try to get these keys or the nonces, and you try to feed it to this lattice-based technique, which is essentially, reveals you the actual signing key in less than 1 hour. Okay, so in all these attacks that we show, you were able to recover this key in less than 1 hour. So to summarize, I would like to say that side channels attacks expose a gap between theory and practice of crypto. Microarchitecture attacks really encompass the intersection of architecture and computer security. And architectures largely have been developed to enhance performance, like as we saw, cache memory prefetchers, branch predictions. Okay, even when we talk about spectre and meltdown, out of order, speculative executions and so on, are all features in your processor to enhance performance. But then I would like to stress that leakage due to the architecture is a very important thing to study, and I would like to kind of highlight that Intel stock fell by around 3% after the spectre and meltdown. So therefore, it is important to take security at the beginning of your design process. And this makes design for security, along with other objectives like performance, power, and energy, so important. So probably it's a good time to think about a clean paper design, particularly when we have got things like RISC-V around us, which gives us nice open source platforms to play around and do experiments. So I would like to kind of conclude my talk with this nice observations from these gentlemen, Hennessy and Patterson, which says that, one of the most important, fascinating things about computer architecture is now security, and therefore it is a good time to venture in this domain. So I would also like to do a bit of advertising for this conference that we do every year in India, which is called as SPACE, or Security, Privacy and Applied Crypto Engineering. Every year it's held in December. This time again, due to the pandemic, it will be done online. So if some of you are interested, please register. It's almost at zero cost, and you can be attending the talks. There are some textbooks that we essentially wrote in this process, one on hardware security, and in particular on timing channels, which we were discussing in today's talk, and also on fault tolerance in cryptography. So if you're interested, you can take a look at this. So finally, I would like to say thank you. And if there are any questions, I would like to happily address them. I would like to kind of conclude with this slight modification of this famous word from Edward Lockhart, which says that every contact by a criminal leaves behind a trace. I'll kind of a bit modify it and may say that every computation leaves a trace. Okay, and that is largely what we have been studying in our line of research. So thank you. If there are any questions, I would be happy to address.
Oh, that certainly is a very catchy title. And thank you for a very wonderful talk and giving a very nice overview of the side channel attacks, fault attacks, and microarchitectural attacks. So thank you very much. I myself have a couple of questions, but before that, one of our faculty members, Professor Prasanna, who has joined via YouTube, so he wrote me a mail to present this question to you. He asked, what happens in crypto systems if you lose the key? Okay. Can fault injection methods recover the key for a legitimate but absent-minded users? I understand nowadays he's interested in So we know that right now many Bitcoin exchanges, the owner loses the key and then everything's gone, right? So he's kind of interested, as I understand, on problems where the key is lost, but something can be recovered. Now his question is, why not use all these attacks maybe to recover the key?
That's a very good observation, and maybe would be a very interesting thing to look at. I mean, the idea is that if the key is embedded and stored in some kind of internal memory, and it can be used during the computation. So remember that these attacks that I mentioned are not attacks at rest, but rather they're attacks during computation. So that means, right, it has to be used in an internal computation. And once it is used in the computation, then yes, these techniques can be exploited.
Okay, great. Audience, any other question, please? In the meantime, let me ask you a question. So that the light bulbs and the thing was a very, very interesting example. So, and with the proliferation of IoT devices and not to very tiny devices, right? So certainly, counteracting these attacks or designing countermeasures is certainly quite a challenging task, right? So what do you think are the possible future directions on devising countermeasures for extremely resource limited devices?
Yeah, that's I would say, $1 million question.
Okay.
I mean, countermeasure design is probably one of the most challenging and coveted lines of research. Mm-hmm. So we already know that people are developing techniques like threshold implementations was one way of countering, and a sound way of countering based on very nice principles on information theory. Mm-hmm. And like secret sharing. But at the same time, right, I mean, people have shown that they are quite complex, and therefore people have come out with new techniques like domain-oriented masking and other techniques in that direction, which are trying to kind of like make things lightweight. But of course, the moment you make things a bit lightweight, there are exactly like things that are also becomes exploitable. So I would say that this is the like a race that will continue, and I think that along with the countermeasures, it is also equally important, probably particularly for lightweight devices, as you mentioned, is to develop defense mechanisms or other detection mechanisms. Like, for example, you can probably live with a bit of insecurity, but if you know that like sufficient number of observations are revealed, then potentially you can do techniques like change the key or so on, right, to essentially kind of evade such kind of sidechain attack techniques. Because most of the sidechain attack techniques in noisy environments needs certain number of observations, right? So if you can predict that, then that can be one way of potentially countering.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. Any other questions, please?
Thank you, Professor Debdeep, for the wonderful talk. Is there one single countermeasure which can address multiple side channel attacks? Like, there are like power side channel attacks, timing side channel attacks, cache side channel attacks. There are like multiple things. Can we say one countermeasure to address, which has to be implemented at the primary level to address multiple side channels?
Actually, Annapurna stole my question. So what I wanted to ask was, can we have a combined fault and side channel countermeasure?
Yeah, combined, like power and fault attacks are something that we are also trying to study. Actually, so actually in this year in Asia Crypt, we have a paper by one of my students, Shandeep, and us, where we try to show that like that indeed combining these attack vectors are makes the attacks even more powerful. Okay, and therefore, if you have a protection only for power attack or a protection only for fault attack, it doesn't work actually. So it is good to probably have I would say a combo, countermeasure. But at the same time, it is also very challenging, right, to make. And often we have seen that a protection against a fault attack can also contradict with a protection against a power attack. Because, just to give an example, like when you are, like protecting against fault attacks, you often do several computations, like you do redundancy, right? And in that process, you may actually end up in increasing the signal of your power traces, actually. And that can make it more vulnerable against power attacks. Okay. And likewise, if you are making a protection against power attack, that can probably make it more vulnerable against sidechain attacks.
Oh, okay.
Certainly, yeah, it's certainly an exciting field and a lot of questions. Yeah, Annapurna, please go ahead.
Professor, from the manufacturer's point of view, from the CPU manufacturer or the device manufacturer point of view, what should be the primary thing they should keep in mind while designing the the device from to protect against?
So I think you have to, at least at this point, you have to take the attack vector seriously, and you have to kind of, like have, so every attack, for example, needs a bit of, like, I would say treatment, and accordingly, like there should be the countermeasures that that essentially are developed based on those analyses. Okay, so for example, our designs cannot be, even after like seeing so many attacks, cannot be agnostic of those attack vectors. Okay, so if you, for example, want to address, so you cannot, for example, shut down the cache or shut down the branch. That is not done, right? That cannot be, that is not doable. So you need to kind of address them in your processor designs, and there are many research that are being developed in the direction of countermeasures. We just need to educate ourselves and like address those countermeasures in our designs.
Okay.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Any other questions, please? So if there aren't any questions, then let's.
There is
one more. Okay. Yes.
In the chat window, there is a question from Professor Ashish. Has anyone explored side channel attacks on MPC?
Very interesting.
Yeah, that's a nice question. I mean, like explicitly, I would say that the threshold implementations, right, that we talk about, people have tried to, so the side channel attacks, as you understand, right, are largely developed on the hardware designs, right, on the hardware designs that you essentially, implement. But so the idea, I would say, is that side channel attacks on threshold implementations which have been developed using the ideas of multi-party computations probably can give a hint on like how you can extend it to more like evolved multi-party computation crypto systems. But I would rather say that this is something that I would also try to look into the literature. I cannot give any offhand answer on this. I mean, one of the things that I think is probably going to be interesting is because of the fact that since it is a distributed computation, right, on which you set up your MPCs, right, so you probably need to compromise on multiple parties, and that would be an interesting thing to look at. Because if you compromise only on one party, that party, even if you know it right, because of your threshold settings, will not compromise on the secret, right? So you probably need to do again an attack in coercion, a side channel attack in coercion to like still be able to break it. But it's an interesting question, and I think we need to look into it in details.
And also, I mean, as always, the MPC can possibly contribute to combined countermeasures, right? MPC techniques, yeah. We never know. So
right. So I mean, people have actually applied MPC techniques for AES countermeasures. Okay, and I would say rather candidly, they are hopelessly inefficient at this point. Yes. But at the same time, right, they work in theory. Okay, so yes. It would be interesting to see the balance.
Yes.
Yeah. One last question, Professor. Sorry. How do you see the future of hardware security in India? My IIT Kharagpur is leading research in hardware security. And how do you see the future of hardware security in India?
Well, I would say rather, I'm quite, happy to see that many other schools, right, around the country are now developing pedagogy on hardware security. Like many of the top IITs, like IIT Madras, IIT Kanpur, are essentially developing courseworks on on hardware security. Likewise, there are many NITs which are also developing pedagogy on hardware security. So I see a lot of promise, and I would also like to mention that often there is a kind of thought that you need expensive equipments to start research on hardware security, but at the same time, there are nowadays many low-cost devices that people are commercializing also in the domain of hardware security, and that can be an impetus on the overall hardware security research, where a low-cost budget can be sufficient to at least do meaningful research in this direction.
And from the industry point of view,
the encouraging thing I would say is that there are many Indian partners inside the country which have now, like interest in hardware security, and we are also getting a lot of questions and like projects in this domain. So that I think is a booster to work in this domain inside India as well.
Oh, wonderful to hear, sir.
Okay, yes, thank you, Annapurna, for the very nice questions. And if there aren't any, let's thank Professor Debdeep Mukhopadhyay again for a wonderful talk. So we'll hope to have you, in person sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
Thank you,
again.
everyone. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So that brings us to the end of the first talk. So, and very exciting talk will next be presented by Professor Jar Andrews,